So, did everybody get your Starbucks cards? Hopefully next time we have one of these events, we'll be able to send some actual food like we did the first event. We just couldn't do it with the hot weather. They're not shipping in the heat, but maybe next time we will be able to do that. So it looks like I've got a lot of people on and I don't have anybody else that's, so let's get going. I'll just start out with a few comments and then I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Uberti. Good morning all and welcome to this Ask the Doctor Zoom morning discussion with Dr. Joseph P. Uberti. Dr. Uberti is Division Chief of Hematology and Co-Director of the Bone Marrow Transplant Program at the Barbara Ann Cancer Institute. And you know what, Sid, I'm going to mute you. You're making noise. So, before we begin our discussion, I'd first like to thank our very important partners, Bristol Myers Squibb, Amgen, Adaptive Biotechnologies, Carey Farm Therapeutics, Takeda Oncology, and Dova Pharmaceuticals. I don't know if you can see that. Does that look backwards to everyone, or is that, can you see that right? To me,
no,
it looks
right. That's right.
Okay. Anyway, thank you. We couldn't do this without the support of our partners. I want to tell you a little bit about Dr. Uberti. He is the Chief of Hematology and also the Co-Director of the Bone Marrow Transplant Program, which is actively involved in clinical research in bone marrow and peripheral blood cell transplants. So if you want to know anything about bone marrow transplants or stem cell transplants, Dr. Uberti is the expert. I also want to introduce Sid Moss, who I just muted, but I'll unmute him in a minute. The founder of Cure Multiple Myeloma Corporation. Sid is the one you can thank for those Starbucks gift cards. So Sid, I'm going to unmute you now if I can find you on here. Oh, let's see, how do I do that? Might not, can you unmute yourself, Sid?
I think it's fine. Let's just go to Dr. Uberti.
You're unmutable. No, just talk.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, well, just I also like to say thank you for joining us today, and certainly are appreciative to our sponsors and to Dr. Uberti, who is a wonderful guy and a great speaker. Thank you for joining us today, Dr. Uberti.
Thank you very much.
So the way that this will work is Dr. Uberti will provide us with a little background on himself. For those of you that don't know him, then he'll give us an update on multiple myeloma treatments, transplants, and other news as it relates to multiple myeloma. Then we'll open up the discussions to questions from you. Please use the chat button, and the chat button is in different places on different computers. My chat button is at the bottom. I know some have it on the side if they're on a iPad or a tablet. So just find your chat button and you can type in a question and I will read those questions. I've also taken some questions from the group already. And then we can open it up and unmute people and ask you for questions from the floor. So again, thank you for taking the time for the Zoom discussion and I will hand it over to Dr. Uberti. And please first just give us a little background on yourself so people know a little bit more about you, those that don't, and then we'll go from there.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me. It's always a pleasure to speak to a group like this, where it's patients rather than physicians and other people I give talks to. So as you heard, I run the transplant program here. I run the heme malignancy program here at Karmanos Cancer Center. Most of my clinical research and my clinical time is spent doing transplant. So transplants become an important factor in many hematologic diseases, and certainly very important in multiple myeloma. So multiple myeloma, as an example, is the #1 disease we do transplants for, not only here at our center, but in the world, in the United States right now. So right now, as an example, there's 9,000 who undergo transplant for multiple myeloma on a yearly basis. Right here at our center, we do about 130 transplants for multiple myeloma a year. Most of them are first transplants. Sometimes we do second transplants on patients for multiple myeloma. So most of our research is geared towards how can we improve the outcome of patients undergoing transplant for multiple myeloma. Probably the two most active areas of investigation we have ongoing here is looking at maintenance therapy after transplant for multiple myeloma. That is comparing standard maintenance therapy to investigational types of maintenance therapy to see if we can improve the outcome. And we also run all the CAR T-cell programs for multiple myeloma. As you know, this is the newest type of cellular therapy being used for multiple myeloma. The therapy is not approved for the use in multiple myeloma, but approved in other hematologic malignancies. So we're currently running 2 trials, I think, right now, looking at the use of CAR T-cells for multiple myeloma. Most patients come to me after they've initiated treatment for multiple myeloma, seeking an opinion about whether or not I believe they should go through transplant, and I go through the risks and benefits of transplant with them, and I try to guide them through the transplant as safely as possible. You know, we've made many improvements, certainly, as you all know, in the treatment of multiple myeloma, not just in transplant, but in the various treatment options available. Drugs are being newly approved for the treatment of multiple myeloma at a record pace right now. So there are new drugs available almost every other month. So fortunately, we have many drugs available for multiple myeloma. Unfortunately, we haven't yet achieved a cure for myeloma. But certainly patients are living longer with multiple myeloma, having less complications, but still we are searching for the curative therapy, which has been a bit elusive up till now. So we consider transplant as one of the various and very good options for patients with multiple myeloma. Again, we do many of these, 120 to 130 a year. That's the #1 disease that transplants are done for around the world right now. What are the new things we are doing? Again, as I mentioned, what will happen with CAR T cells for multiple myeloma? I know I've talked about this before, perhaps to your groups, but let me just go over it again. So this is a therapy that's not approved by the Food and Drug Administration for multiple myeloma, but it is approved for other diseases. And the area in multiple myeloma is using the same concept for CAR T cells, as has been shown to be very effective in other diseases. The basic concept is we take your cells out of your body, your lymphocytes, and we infect them with a virus that can target multiple myeloma cells. And the cells we target with the CAR T cells is usually the BCMA antigen, which stands for B cell maturation antigen, which is present on all myeloma cells, almost all myeloma cells. And those cells are then sent off to a manufacturing facility. They're injected with this virus. This virus is able to get into the cell. It puts an antibody on the surface that targets myeloma cells. After a 3-week manufacturing capability, they're sent back to us frozen, and we give it to the patient. The patient, prior to the administration of the cells, gets some mild chemotherapy as an outpatient to allow the cells we put into them to reproduce better and be more active. The patient is hospitalized after the infusion of the cells for 2 to 3 weeks, perhaps, after the infusion of the cells, although the outpatient chemotherapy is given, as mentioned, as an outpatient. There are several toxicities to the therapy that we look for. People can have fevers, chills, hypotension, low blood pressure. They can get hypoxemic, low amounts of oxygen in their blood. It could cause severe neurotoxicity too. So there's some unique toxicities we see only in CAR T cells that are seen in the myeloma CAR T cells that are under development now. To undergo most of these trials for CAR T cells, you have to fail at least 3 types of therapy for multiple myeloma, including daratumumab. So you have to have failed a number of therapies to go on to the investigational trials. The outcomes of the investigational trials have been very good. Patients who have been refractory to many treatments can go into complete remission with administration of CAR T cells. The length of the remission last varies from CAR T cell to CAR T cell, but they have been complete remissions for 2 or 3 years. So certainly it seems like it'll be an effective therapy for multiple myeloma. We expect FDA approval. We thought it was going to be approved later this year for multiple myeloma, but because of the COVID-19 issues, it probably won't be until 2021. Where in 2021, I can't give you any idea quite yet, but it should be approved in 2021. The eligibility for the approved product will probably be similar to what we're using to put patients on our investigational trials, which means you have to fail 3 therapies, including daratumumab. You have to have good kidney and heart and lung function and kidney function as well. So that's probably what it's going to look like when it gets FDA approved for treatment, which we suspect will be next year. The safety profile has been manageable. There are some toxicities involved in it. The efficacy has been very good. People do go into complete remission after having fairly refractory disease prior to the administration of the CAR T cells. It's been a little bit difficult with the other CAR T cells. There's a financial issue that's difficult on CAR T cells. It turns out that the government doesn't pay us quite what we need to give these and not lose a lot of money on them. So we found with the other CAR T cell treatments, we lose $200,000 to $300,000 per patient based on what the reimbursement is from the Medicare, which kind of drives the reimbursement of most of the CAR T cells. So that's an issue that we have to work on as a community of physicians and a community of physicians who take care of patients with myeloma to improve the commitment. So that's a CAR T cell story. Where we are, we're still in investigational trials. We expect it to be approved by the Food and Drug Administration in the end of this year or early next year, but it's difficult to say with certainty. Will that be a primary therapy that will be used in place of transplant? We don't know that quite yet, but it is possible that may be used in place of transplant. We may be using it in the earlier therapy of CAR T cells, but perhaps better efficacy. So instead of using it after you fail all these lines of therapy, you may need to try it upfront in patients with myeloma who are more newly diagnosed before they have failed all these lines of therapy, before their myeloma cells become resistant to all these lines of therapy. But that will only come in the future. The other thing we're looking at is to improve the maintenance therapy in myeloma after transplant. The standard maintenance therapy, as those of you who know have been through a transplant, is usually Revlimid. The dose of Revlimid is usually started at 10 milligrams, which is a little bit lower than the dose that Revlimid is usually used for the treatment of myeloma, which is 25 milligrams. And it's given by itself. And we started usually 100 days after transplant, and most patients tolerate it fairly well. Again, it's not a perfect thing because it still doesn't prevent relapses entirely, but it does prolong the progression. So they stay in remission longer if they go on Revlimid. So we're looking at ways to improve that. So right now we have a randomized trial looking at Revlimid versus Revlimid and daratumumab to try to prolong the prevention of progression after an autologous transplant. So those are the two major things we're looking at in myeloma in terms of the transplant unit. As you know, Dr. Zonder, who runs our multiple myeloma service here, he has a lot of investigational trials that look at patients not undergoing transplant or not undergoing CAR T cells that also can be used in patients. So some of his trials, as an example, target the same antigen, the BCMA, that the CAR T cells target, but by a different mechanism. They have antibodies directed against the BCMA antigen. They have what's called BiTEs, which are immunologically active compounds that could be directed against the BCMA antigen. So there's a lot of investigational therapy that's targeting this one antigen, including the CAR T cells, including things that are called BiTE antibodies and just regular antibodies. So there's a lot of investigational trials going on here, both in the treatment of multiple myeloma before transplant, alternative cellular therapies such as CAR T cells, and maintenance therapy after transplant. So maybe I'll stop there. I saw one question pop up on the chat thing about a root canal before transplant, I believe, but I didn't see the full question.
Okay, I can read it to you.
Okay.
Is a history of root canals a risk factor for transplant?
No, it shouldn't be, unless it's a very complicated issue, but that shouldn't prevent anybody from going to transplant if they're a candidate and we feel comfortable moving ahead.
So I do have a few questions, and please feel free to type some questions into the chat. Here we've got, we have plenty of time to answer some questions. I have a few that came in before this, so I'll just go ahead and read one to you right now. This question is, I just recently decided not to proceed with a SCT. I am 72 and am still in introduction therapy with an M spike of 0.8, down from 3.5 last October. I'm in fairly good health, but am very concerned with recovery from SCT since COVID-19 is still present. Would I still be a candidate for an SCT a year from now if I continue to be stable?
So let me go over that a little bit. So when the COVID issues hit in the state of Michigan, we did back off on a lot of transplants for multiple myeloma. So we advised people to stay on standard therapy. We tried to collect their stem cells and made the decision to delay their transplant until the COVID-19 issue was a bit under better control. Right now, certainly at our center, it is a bit under very good control. We don't have any COVID patients in the hospital right now, as an example. And we've been restarting the program. So we're bringing in all of our patients who need transplant, whether it's for multiple myeloma or other diseases, and just schedule them like they would routinely do without the COVID-19. For all of our patients, we test them for COVID-19 before they start the transplant process, and we test every patient in the hospital now for COVID-19, just to minimize the risk factors that patients could be exposed to it during the COVID-19 pandemic here. And certainly during the month of March and April, we were, as many medical centers, very fearful of what's going to happen with patients. So we think we've got this under control fairly good for our transplant patients. We haven't had a single patient who's come into transplant after March or April have had COVID-19. We screen our patients, I think, fairly effectively. We screen our staff fairly effectively. We take all the protective and cautionary measures when they're in the hospital to prevent any transmission of that sort of virus. And so far, we've been able to successfully bring patients in and get them out without having any problem with COVID-19. Now, I don't want to be cavalier about this. The COVID-19 is a big issue. So we're trying our best to do this as safely as possible. And I think we've instituted the safety features as we have in all the transplant centers around the country who've all restarted their transplant programs, I think, fairly safely and fairly effectively, initiating all these features to protect patients who come in for transplant. So I think it is safe to undergo transplant for multiple myeloma right now. We're doing it routinely. We're admitting patients every week who have multiple myeloma for transplant. Again, we're making sure they don't have any symptoms or signs of COVID-19. Everyone gets tested for COVID-19. We have weekly meetings with our ID group about COVID-19 infections, how they're evolving in our patient population, and what changes we need to make to ensure everybody's safety. So I think we as a community of transplant physicians feel safe about bringing patients in for transplant right now, given all the things that are happening outside and the pandemic issues of COVID-19. Obviously, when you get home from a transplant, we do caution you to use the same criteria and same mitigation strategies that we've recommended for everybody. Use masks wherever you go, stay at least 6 feet away from everyone, make sure you don't go in big crowds and things that increase your exposure to COVID-19. So we think it's safe. I think if you want to wait a year, I think that's fine also. We have mostly made the recommendation to try to do transplant earlier in the disease course than later in the disease course. So sometimes if patients don't want to do a transplant right away, we at least ask them to collect their stem cells. And the reason is the more chemotherapy you receive, the little bit harder it is to collect your stem cells. So patients who are on Revlimid, as an example, sometimes repeated months of being on Revlimid makes it harder to collect stem cells. So if we do want to delay a patient, or if a patient wants to be delayed, we recommend they get their stem cells collected a little bit earlier, and they go back on chemotherapy, and then they come to transplant after when everybody feels a little bit more comfortable about it. Now, there's one cautionary note in this. Some insurance companies don't allow you to do that process, the stem cell collection, unless you're committed to doing transplant within 1 year of stem cell collection. So we can delay things. We don't want to delay it so we put extra burden and financial burdens on the patient. But sometimes insurance companies don't let us get money for this unless we do it within 1 year of the transplant. Or 1 year of the stem cell collection, I'm sorry. I hope that answered that question. It was a long answer, but.
I think that was a good answer, and that probably answered questions from other people too that are concerned about going into a hospital. And I do know just from calling the hospital that there's quite a process even to get in, and there's rules that Karmanos has right on the phone when you dial in.
Yes, that's true. Yes. So every person, so there's some restrictions on friends and relatives who can come into the hospital, as an example. We only allow one person per day for each patient. If they're visiting the patient in the hospital, we only allow that person to stay between 8 in the morning to 6 at night in the hospital with the patient, and only one person and the same person every day. When patients come into our clinic, we do not recommend anybody comes with them into the clinic. They come up by themselves. They get screened before they come into clinic. They have a verbal history. Are you sick? Do you have fevers? They get their temperature checked. They have to wear a mask in our clinic. and everybody in our clinic is wearing masks and facial protection and eye protection right now. So we try to do our best, and we use all the recommended activities by the CDC and all the organizations, including our infectious disease group here, to prevent exposure to us, to the patients, to anybody who works with us in the clinic areas.
That's good. The next question I have is, of all the vaccines being developed, and I'm thinking that this probably means the COVID-19 vaccines, are any effective for someone with multiple myeloma?
You mean, are they effective for the treatment of multiple myeloma, or are they effective in patients who have multiple myeloma?
I think that she means in patients that
Yes.
have multiple myeloma.
So we don't know the answer to that question, and that's going to be a critical issue for patients who undergo cancer therapy, how this vaccine will, when the vaccines are available, how it'll work in cancer patients. In general, cancer patients have a little bit more of a blunted response to vaccines than other patients. And that's because some of the chemotherapy we use, some of the therapy we use to treat the disease, sometimes blunts your body's immune response to vaccines. So hopefully it will be effective, but we won't know that for a while. So that's a good question, and that's going to be a tough one for our cancer patients, whether or not these vaccines will be available to them, and more importantly, will be safe for them and effective for them.
Do you have any idea right now, or any general thoughts on when we will be seeing vaccines?
You know, we follow this a little bit closely, and we just had a discussion about this earlier today. I don't know if anybody is sure when that will be available. I know we've heard that one may be available later this year, early next year. I think that's a very optimistic and perhaps unrealistic view of when these vaccines will be available. If we look at the track record of how other vaccines are developed, they usually take a year or two at least, and sometimes 4 to 5 years. Now, having said that, we have new technology and new techniques to make better vaccines than we've ever had before. And perhaps this will shorten the time to make vaccines. So that's what we're hoping for. So I'm not sure what will happen with vaccines. I'd be very surprised if we had one by the end of this year or early next year. But sometimes things happen. And let's hope this happens, because I think this has been terrible for everybody. It's been terrible for everyone around the world, our economy, everything that goes along with it. So
I think
hopefully there will be one.
I think we can all agree with that.
Yeah.
I mean, we can't have our breakfast. We have to do this Zoom discussion.
This has changed everybody's life in so many ways.
It has, but one thing I think that is kind of actually has been good about it is, I mean, we have people that are here on this Zoom today that couldn't come physically to a breakfast because
Right.
they're far away or whatever. So you know, we can reach more people like this, and I think it's something that will be continued on, you know, with these kind of discussions and things, just because it is
Absolutely. And so the telehealth has exploded. We do telehealth all the time, so patients don't have to take a 1 hour car drive down here, park, and have 1 hour car drive back. So it makes it so much easier. So when telehealth is a reasonable option, that's really great, I think, for our patients. And it avoids a lot of the problems we have that's going on.
Okay, next question I have is, with the drugs we take, the drugs for multiple myeloma, is there any over-the-counter drug we can take once in a while for pain?
So that depends on different things. So let me just give you an example. If you have some kidney problems from multiple myeloma, the medications that are nonsteroidal anti-inflammatories, and these are medications like Motrin and Advil, those are very difficult on your kidneys. So that's a difficult one to take for myeloma, especially if you have kidney involvement of your myeloma. That is, your kidneys aren't working as well. The safest thing over the counter right now, I think anybody would recommend, is Tylenol. You know, if you have to go above that, then you have to see your doctor about what other medications they can prescribe for you that aren't over the counter. But I think of all the drugs we have available to us as an over-the-counter outpatient, Tylenol is the safest one we can take. I mean, aspirin's a little bit, you know, we use aspirin to prevent blood clots in patients with myeloma, but I don't think we would recommend to use that for pain control.
Those are the questions that I have here. So I'm going to ask everybody that's on this call, if you want to ask a question, please just unmute yourself. If you can't do that, I can actually, let's see, I think I can. I don't know if I can unmute everybody at once, but but I think I can unmute you. Yes, I can. So if you want to ask a question, please just unmute yourself and ask away. We've got some time and happy to hear your question. No one has a question?
Not too many questions.
Yeah.
I have a lot of good answers if you give me the question.
Right. I'm sure that you do, that you have a lot of answers for questions that are out there. Nobody's putting anything in the chat. You're all happy with this?
Let me mention one more thing, if I can, from one of the previous questions. I think one of the women asked, she was 72 years of age, and age often comes up when you can go through a transplant. Are transplant just as effective in older patients? Is the toxicity more? Do we worry about older patients going to transplant? You know, certainly patients with multiple myeloma are older. The average age, or median age, is 69 or so of patients with multiple myeloma. So we do transplant older and older patients. So the oldest patient we've transplanted right now is at 80 or 81 years of age. So we do transplant, I think, healthy patients who are older, you know, in the age group of 75 to 80 even. And there are many patients with multiple myeloma in that age group who may benefit from a transplant. When we look at the data kind of retrospectively, they seem to do as good as patients who are younger. So we do think multiple myeloma transplants can be done in older patients. Obviously, if you have heart disease or lung disease or kidney disease, we have to take that into account. But given that those are stable, we can move to transplant in older patients fairly safely. The hospitalization, again, is about 14 days for a transplant. So we have been recommending transplants in older and older patients as we move on here and gain more expertise in taking care of patients with all the problems that can occur through a transplant.
Anybody else? We've got, we have quite a group here. I would think that we would have some questions. Jerry?
Yeah, this might be a little bit dependent upon my personal situation, doctor, but I'm just curious to what you have to say. I had a stem cell transplant in August of last year, and in January of this year, I started on a Revlimid maintenance program. My M protein coming out of stem cell transplant was 0.3, but over the first 5 months of this year on Revlimid maintenance, it slowly crept up to 0.6. So about 6 or 8 weeks ago, my oncologist decided to put me on Ninlaro, and I've been on Ninlaro for 2 months. And I'm kind of wondering, from your perspective, what options you see down the road that might be possible if Ninlaro doesn't work either.
Well, you know, it depends a little bit about what you had before the transplant, but usually, you know, not everybody responds to a transplant. Some patients do progress. You know, we would probably recommend, you know, perhaps looking at other combinations of therapy. So most patients start out with Revlimid, Velcade, and dexamethasone. I'm not sure if that's what you started out with, but that's a very common regimen patients get, probably the first regimen most patients get. So, you know, there's a lot of different combinations that can be tried. You know, we try to establish and be sure that there's evidence of progression of your myeloma. So one thing sometimes we look at is just the blood count of your paraprotein level, which did go up, I think, a bit. And certainly that does suggest signs of progression. So the other thing is to try more aggressive therapy. So instead of just, are you on Ninlaro by itself, or are you on with anything else?
Just by itself, three pills, one pill a week for 3 weeks and 1 week off.
So the other thing is to try some additional medications, you know, add dexamethasone to it, go for more 2 or 3 drug regimens, some of the standard 2 or 3 drug regimens, which would be the next step for the treatment. You know, those are the most effective treatments, obviously 3 drug regimens. Some of the newer drugs out there are very effective in treatment. So if Ninlaro doesn't work, that's what my recommendation would be, more intensive treatment.
Well, how many months would you suggest going with Ninlaro and not see a change?
I would go at least 2 or 3 months. You know, give it 2 or 3 months to see what happens with the M protein. And the easiest thing to measure is their M protein.
Yeah, I'm just coming up to the end of my 2 months now, first 2 months.
And it's gone up. Has it gone up on the Ninlaro, or is it?
Well, no, the only M protein measurement I've had was after 1 month, and it was stable at 0.6.
Okay. I mean, if it stays stable and you have no side effects on the Ninlaro, I think that's a way to stay on that and just go with that.
Absolutely no side effects to anything.
And you just watch the paraprotein level as you go on further with the drug. and it's a pretty sensitive marker to the myeloma progressing. And that's assuming you don't have any bone pain or any other symptoms of myeloma.
Nothing, nothing.
Yeah, it's very reasonable. So, if there's, the problem is with all these medications or all the change in treatment, we don't have a lot of data on that. So we don't have a lot of data on somebody in your situation, fails Revlimid or Revlimid wasn't working, switched over to Nalaro just as a single drug. And it's like a maintenance therapy for Nalaro instead of Revlimid. And we think that works and we think it should work, but there's really no clinical trials that support that. But it makes sense biologically. And especially if you're not having any side effects from it and you're doing well otherwise and the levels just staying the same, that seems like a reasonable option to stay on.
I do have another question that came into the chat. This one says, could Dr. Uberti comment on MRD testing in his transplant patients? Is this used often to determine transplant timing and response?
So that's a good question. So MRD testing has just been FDA approved. There's a new company out that has MRD testing for multiple myeloma. We haven't been using that as a indication of going to transplant. So even patients who are MRD negative, we have recommended to move to transplant. So we don't use that too much in determining the transplant option. If you're MRD or not MRD positive, we recommend the transplant if you've had a good response to therapy. So, and part of that is we don't know what that really means in terms of transplant outcomes. We don't know if MRD negative patients go to transplant, they do better or they don't need a transplant as opposed to MRD positive patients. Maybe nobody, MRD means minimal residual disease. Maybe everybody knows that, but
I do.
It's the best test of whether or not you have any myeloma left in your body. So the standard tests to look for myeloma are the bone marrow biopsies, the blood work, the urine testing, the bone surveys, the PET CT scans. MRD testing, minimal residual disease, is the very, very most sensitive way to look for myeloma. And some patients who undergo chemotherapy, undergo therapy for myeloma, undergo transplant, do achieve MRD negativity. So we can't find any myeloma in their body. And those patients do seem to do better in the long run, but still do relapse. So nobody knows if that is a reason to go or not to go to transplant yet. So although we look at that level, we don't use that as a discriminating factor to go to transplant yet. But in the future, it may be one.
I have another question here. Is there housing close to the transplant center for families during this procedure?
So there is housing. So we have affiliations with several hotels that are within 2 or 3 miles of our transplant center. And patients, if they want to stay down here, they would have to rent a room, which we have fairly good rates for housing for our patients. So the closest hotel is one of the casinos, actually. So it's the Motor City Casino, I think, is the closest one. So it's actually quite nice for our patients. They put them on a nice floor with no smoking. They have shuttles that go back and forth to the cancer center. It's free parking for the patients. So a lot of our patients have stayed there. And there's other facilities that are hotels around the Detroit area and actually in the suburban areas too that patients have stayed at. So unfortunately, we don't own anything that patients can stay at, but we have some financial activity with some of the hotels around here that help our patients stay there for a lower price than they normally charge other patients or other people who are using the hotel.
That's good. Okay, here's another one. Can you explain the benefits of a SCT as opposed to not doing the SCT? How can it affect longevity?
Okay, so how a stem cell transplant works and why we recommend it is that it kills off myeloma cells by a different mechanism than, let's say, you're on RVD therapy. So the reason we don't cure people with therapy yet with the therapy we have is that the myeloma cells learn to become resistant to the therapy. They're smart cells, these myeloma cells. They have ways of overcoming the activity of our therapy that we use. When we do a transplant, we use a drug called melphalan, which kills off myeloma cells by a very different mechanism than like Revlimid, Velcade, and dexamethasone do. So we think we're killing off cells that have become resistant to the previous therapy. And therefore it provides a benefit because you're killing off more myeloma cells. And the more you kill off, the better off the patient will be, I think, in terms of preventing disease progression. So that's what we think the benefit of a transplant is. We're killing off stem cells, we're killing off myeloma cells by different mechanism, killing off the cells that are resistant to your current therapy, and allows you to be myeloma free or prevent the progression of myeloma for a longer period of time. Most of the data has shown that the benefit of transplant is that it improves progression-free survival. So if they compare transplant to no transplant, it improves progression-free survival from about 2.5 years to 5 years. So that's the benefit of a transplant. When we've looked at this closely, it doesn't improve overall survival, or at least we can't show that, but at least improves the time that your myeloma is under control by about 2 to 2.5 years over standard therapy. So that's what we're looking at. 2.5 years doesn't sound like much, which it isn't. You know, we want it to be 10 years, but that's what it is. So that's the benefit of a transplant. We call it a benefit in progression-free survival, but again, it's been difficult to show a progression in overall survival, which is the longevity question you're talking about here. We think it does, and we think with the introduction of Revlimid as maintenance therapy, it may improve longevity in some of our patients. One of the questions that's really become is when to do the transplant. I think everybody believes transplant is effective therapy. The question is, do you have to do it as part of the upfront therapy, or can you wait and go through several rounds of other types of therapy and use it as a second or third or fourth line down the road in the treatment of myeloma? As you all know better than I am, patients with myeloma go through a number of different types of treatment because sooner or later every treatment fails. So where do you put a transplant in? You know, our current recommendation is put a transplant early in the upfront treatment of myeloma, usually with the initiation of therapy. But you can wait. You know, we try to get it early, but you can wait till it goes to second or third line, and it will still be effective to patients.
I have another question that came in. When managing a patient who also has chronic ITP or chronic liver disease before transplant, if they experience thrombocytopenia, then what is your therapy approach to increase their platelet count before the transplant is conducted? Would you manage that same word again, or another physician as a team approach to therapy?
So that's, you know, it's difficult. So first of all, we have to make sure it's ITP. So we want to confirm that and make sure it's that, nothing else is causing their platelet count to be low. It might be a little difficult to collect stem cells. Sometimes patients with stem cells with a low platelet count have difficulty collecting stem cells, although I can't say. So we try to manage it as best we could with a team approach. You know, there are some medications that can be used to treat ITP, some medications that can increase the platelet count. So we'd like to make sure those have all been used and see what the response is to those medications. You know, there's steroids has been used for ITP, Rituxan has been used for ITP. So a number of treatment options that may help correct the ITP, which may make the transplant a little bit easier and stem cell collection a little bit easier.
One more question we have here. Do you do any allogenic transplants at Karmanos?
We do. So usually we reserve that for patients who are younger, patients who fail therapy, very aggressive therapy, and have exhausted some of their common therapies we have for multiple myeloma. So we do some, not many, probably 3 to 4 a year. So we don't do many, but we do reserve it for patients who fail some of the traditional therapy, who are younger and are progressing very rapidly. So we have recommended that in some of our patients. It's a little bit harder procedure to go through, a little bit longer hospitalization, longer follow-up, and it's a little bit tougher on older patients. So we don't use that as much as we would like to, perhaps. But unless it shows better efficacy with less toxicity, we're going to reserve that for a few patients.
Another question. After 2 years remission, I will be going to Karmanos annual visit. Will my annual visits continue?
Well, we do like to see our patients yearly, and there's a couple of different reasons for that. One is sometimes we come into a situation where after the first transplant, the myeloma progresses, and we do recommend a second transplant. For most of our patients, we do try to collect enough stem cells for 2 transplants. And if there's evidence of progression after a certain amount of time, we might recommend a second transplant. So that's one of the reasons. We like to keep track of our patients too. You know, there's a risk of secondary malignancies after transplant on top of the progression of the myeloma. So we like to keep track of how many patients show those type of changes that might indicate they're developing a secondary malignancy. So we do like to keep annual visits with our patients. It can be telehealth visits if they'd like, but we do like to keep contact of our patients for those two issues.
Those are the questions that I see coming in here. Anyone else have another question? There's also a little button that you can raise your hand. And I think it's under the more. And if you want to speak, just raise your hand or just plain unmute and speak if you want to ask a question. Well, I think that we've covered a lot here today with quite a bit of diverse questions, I think, which is good. I enjoyed this, and I think it's really interesting. If you want, we still have a few minutes, so I'm looking for any more questions. But I also wanted to talk to you just briefly, let everybody know that after this, I'm going to send an email out. The MMRF is holding a 1 o'clock, it's a video conference that they're going to announce something. I don't know what it is, but I'm going to send the link out in case anyone wants to join in to watch that today at 1. If there's nothing else, I really think that this was a very, very interesting session today. I learned a lot. I learned a lot from these sessions. And so I thank you, Doctor.
Well, thank you. It's always a pleasure to talk to the group. And if I can answer any questions, people can contact me if they like. My email address is ubertij@karmanos.org. That's ubertij@karmanos.org. And they can contact you and you can contact me, and I'll be happy to provide that to anybody.
Sure, yeah. If anybody has, you've got my email because I keep sending you things. So if you have any questions, just let me know and I will make sure that we get the answer to the questions you have.
Again, thank you very much.
So with that, I think we'll sign off, and I hope to see you at our next visit. Okay?
Thank you again.
Great day, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.